All right, everybody. We are officially into week 7. And so this is where we make a bit of a turn. We've been talking about some things related to perception, now attention in the last few weeks. Now we're turning our attention to memory. And memory is going to kind of be the core topic that we talk about just about the entire rest of the semester, just because memory is so integral, so central to our notion of what cognition is. So we're going to start out this week with a little bit of a sort of introduction overview, looking at some issues just about memory in general. And then we will be transitioning and focusing in today on specifically sensory memory, which in the text I don't really talk a lot about, and kind of for good reason, just in the sense of moving on. But I'll share a little bit more information about sensory memory with you. And then the next couple videos that we'll do will focus on issues of short-term / working memory. So that'll be the first week, and that will be actually, it'll go for this week and next week, week 7 and 8. And that will take us into where we can start talking about some issues around long-term memory. So let's get started. Memory. So what is memory? Why is it important? Well, memory in a sense is tricky because it can mean lots of different things, okay? Basically what it boils down to is our ability to retain information from one experience and then apply or use it, retrieve it in another situation. And that's kind of the idea that we'll keep in mind as we talk about memory. But it's really important to think about why that's important. And it's important because what happens is at any moment in the environment that you're in, there's a lot of information available in the environment. Um, but what memory does is it allows you to transport information from one experience, one time, one environment to a new one, and sort of use it at that secondary time, integrate it with the information that's available in the environment. So we have access to this incredible amount of information that we wouldn't have access to without our memory. And the important thing to realize is as we work through this, we'll focus a lot on the errors that people make in memory. I mean, that's kind of what we've done all along. We kind of poke around at where people make mistakes, where they make errors, because that informs us something about what's going on. But we have to remember with memory, it's pretty amazing the amount that we hold on to, how efficient it is, and how flexible it is. Okay, so even though we do run into these errors, our memory is pretty powerful and amazing. So we want to kind of keep that in mind as we go along. So what is memory doing? Well, it's informing your perceptual experiences, as we've already seen, all that top-down kind of thing. It's informing your linguistic abilities. You know, your ability to use language at its core is built into as part of the memory system. It underlies our ability to learn, to be in a situation and pick up a piece of information and then apply it at a later time. We'll see how it's central to our sense of self. When we think about ourselves, a lot of what's going on is we're thinking in terms of memory. We're remembering things we've done, and that's how we understand ourselves. It's really important for social functioning. You know, something as simple as remembering somebody's name, but more critically, remembering the cues and the conventions of your culture are really critical to being able to socially function. And so memory underlies all that. We'll see it does a whole lot more too. So as we work along, we'll get a sense of all this that's going on. So memory in one sense is simple, right? You either get information in and you can get it back out, or you can't. But really, when we end up talking about memory, we're going to end up talking about a lot of different kinds of things. We're going to talk about different kinds of information that you can hold on to and retrieve. We're going to talk about different kinds of time spans. You know, the stuff today we'll be talking about order of milliseconds. And by the time, you know, within a week, we'll be talking about holding on to information for over the course of decades. So very different time spans. It involves lots of different systems. So we're going to kind of get into a little bit more about what we mean by system. And it involves a lot of different kinds of processing involved in memory. So it's not just one thing. And that's going to add some complexity to it, but also makes a very rich topic for us to study. So just as a, you know, think about the different kinds of things you have in your memory. Think of all the different kind of things that are stored away there. And what would it be like without memory? We'll kind of poke around and play with this when we have our discussion time on Wednesday. But this is a central issue, is what would it be like if we didn't have memory the way we do? And it would be very different. All right. So let's start off with some of the basics, all right? When we talk about processes in memory, there's three basic things that have to occur. The first thing we have to have is we have to have some form of encoding. And we'll see that there are different forms of encoding, and those different forms of encoding will be applicable in different situations or with different kinds of information, but we need encoding. We need to get the information into our system in some way. We need storage. We need a way to hold on to that information. This is tricky because actually seeing the storage, as we've often talked about with cognition, you can't actually see a memory being stored. But again, we can turn to other methodologies like neuroscience to help inform us. What does storage look like when we're talking about memory? And then we need some way to retrieve the information. We need some way to pull it out and make it accessible so that we can use it at that secondary time. And we'll see that these three processes are constantly of interest to us, and the way we'll talk about them will shift depending on what type of memory we're talking about, but they're always there when we're talking about memory. So keep those in mind. Now, when we break it down, the sort of typical way to kind of break down memory is into three kind of subsets of memory. Okay, so sensory memory, which we'll take a look at today, primary memory, which in the textbook is referred to either short-term memory or working memory, and then long-term memory. And each of these has different distinctions and have been sort of viewed in different ways over the years. But basically, when we look at these, we identify them as separate and distinct forms of memory because we can ask these questions like, what's the information needed for? And if the information is needed in different ways, then that suggests that there's different forms of memory. How long must the information be stored? As you'll see, it varies widely between these different sort of types of memory, and then what kind of information and how is it represented when we store it. All these issues kind of help us differentiate sensory memory, primary memory, long-term memory. So this is an issue that we're going to run into as we talk about this. We're going to look at a lot of different kinds of memory systems. So what do we mean when we say a memory system? Well, what we're meaning is that this is a construct, as we've talked about. Psychological constructs are things, concepts, complex concepts that helps us to describe behaviors and understand sort of the psychological workings. And these concepts, we can't directly observe them because they're constructs, but they help us to understand what we're seeing. So what makes a memory system in this way? Which memory systems are psychological constructs? Well, they're going to be theoretically cohesive. That means typically when we talk about a memory system, we're talking about a system that contains a distinct set of processes that operate on a particular type of information. So when you change the processes or you change the information, you probably are talking about a different system. We're going to differentiate these because the systems are going to be theoretically distinct from one another. So they have to be theoretically cohesive in and of itself, but they also have to differ from one another. They have different purposes or different functions in terms of what they're doing. They operate on different types of information, okay? And one of the things that we'll use is we'll use that kind of notion of converging evidence or converging operations from looking at neuroscientific data. We look for what we call dissociations, okay? So what that means is that in one case, in one situation, we can see evidence of one system functioning, and in a different case, we see a different system functioning. We've dissociated the functions. So we're going to kind of look for that kind of evidence. So keep this in mind. Again, we'll come back to this because it will be kind of a part of the conversation. You'll get more comfortable with it as we move along. But as we talk about these memory systems, remember, they have to be sort of theoretically cohesive. They need to be distinct from one another, and we have to be able to find different kinds of evidence for them. Okay, so when we apply those ideas to the what we call the overall memory, right? We see that three different things kind of fall out. And we kind of said this. We have this sensory memory system. It's going to be distinct from a primary memory. We're going to start out talking about it as short-term memory. We'll revise that as we move along. And then we also have long-term memory. Each one of these is in some way cohesive, they're distinct, and we can find evidence neurophysiologically that helps us distinguish between them, okay? And we call this the modal model because modal means the most commonly occurring. And if you look across all the different accounts of memory, these are the three things that kind of pop out. So we'll spend some time kind of working with each of them. We're only going to spend a little bit of time on the first one, the sensory memory, just because it plays a very particular role very early on. We've already kind of talked about it to some extent. So just based on what we've kind of talked about, this notion of memory, how would we differentiate? Why would sensory memory be considered a different system than long-term memory? I'm not talking about specifics here, but what kind of things would have to be happening for us to differentiate and say sensory memory is different than long-term memory? Okay, so prime yourself just in that way, because now we're going to look at sensory memory. You can fill in some of those details about it, and then you'll see why it's seen as distinct. All right. All right, so sensory memory has been studied by psychologists for a long time. In fact, it was one of the first things that psychologists were interested in because realistically there were research scientists interested in issues of sensation and perception before psychology actually existed. And so these researchers did a lot of work kind of looking at this idea of what can get into consciousness. That was kind of like the thing that they were looking at. What can we perceive? What can be a percept at any one time? So this connects very closely to some of the issues we've already considered around perception. We already talked about when we perceive the world, we don't take in all the information. So how much can we hold on to? And as a memory issue, that's what we would focus on. And so the way that they would talk about this is what was called the span of apprehension. And that's just about how much information can pass into consciousness, can you perceive at any one time. They use these fascinatingly complex and neat mechanical devices called tachistoscopes or T-scopes. And they could control down to like 10, 20 milliseconds the exposure of items using these. They've got pretty good at it. And this is pre-digital, you know, this is like the 19th century. And basically what they would do is they'd flash up stimuli and the participants would report what they saw. So here they're focusing on a visual sensory memory, right? And they basically established early on that people can hold on to about between 4 and 8 items in that sensory memory, okay? And we'll come back to that because that changes a little bit when we start looking at it in different ways, but this is just kind of laying some of the groundwork. Now, what they did is they differentiated, you know, we have this sensory memory system, but it actually has a couple different subsystems in it because the subsystems work with different kinds of information. Therefore, they're distinct systems. So we have an iconic memory system, which is visual sensory memory. It has an incredibly large capacity. We don't know exactly how much it can hold on to, but it's a lot. But it has almost instantaneous decay. As soon as the information gets in there, we start to lose it. That's why we can only hold on to a certain number of things. We lose information about a lot of it. It's very susceptible to interference. Any other visual information can distort or make the information that's in the sensory memory unavailable. And the information is held, even if you really are trying, it can be held in the sensory memory as a distinct signal only for about 500 milliseconds. In order to hold on to it for longer, you'd have to move it from the sensory memory into short-term memory. So in this case, the information is considered to be pre-categorical, meaning that it's unprocessed sensory information. It's raw data about the environment around you. And that's sort of where we kind of sit when we think about perception, right? We start talking about perception. Initially, it just comes in, we just have the information, then we have to start making sense of it. So what sensory memory kind of represents is that initial storage when we were talking about perception, where the information is coming in, but we haven't yet worked with it, okay? So you know, like interesting fact, just kind of looking at this historically, you know, it actually was in the 18th century that people started to be interested in this. And this guy put a coal, you know, so it was red on a wheel. And he figured out how fast the wheel had to be spinning in order for you to perceive a continuous circle. And kind of get a sense of what's going on in terms of iconic memory, because in order to perceive a continuous circle of a coal being rotated, you essentially have to hold on to the coal, information about the coal's position the whole way around the rotation. And that's a sense of how much your memory is holding on to at that point. Okay, so that's the iconic or visual sensory memory. We can also think about auditory memory. Now, this wasn't being studied quite as early, but pretty early on, people started to say, well, what about if that's what visual memory is like, what about auditory? And it turns out we have a similar kind of system, an auditory sensory information, again, has a large capacity, it has a brief duration, it's less susceptible to interference in the sense that if we can hold on to it without anything, it can be available for a couple seconds. And this is like the classic kind of like sometimes somebody says something to you and you're like, huh? And as soon as you turn, it's almost like you suddenly hear it, even though they had said it a couple seconds prior. And that's sort of your auditory memory holding on to it, the echoic memory holding on to it. Again, it's sort of pre-categorical. It hasn't been processed, and you can hold on to it for a little bit before you push it into the further down the processing stream of the auditory memory and actually make sense of it. So it's a little distinct. It's different than the visual memory, but has some of the same kind of things. So we group them together, echoic and iconic, as sensory memory, in the sense that they're holding on, they have big capacities, they hold on to information that's unprocessed, it's raw. And yet we can also distinct them, and we can identify distinct subsystems within this sensory memory system because they are working with different information. One is working with visual, one's with auditory. So a couple other interesting facts. I don't know why I got into this interesting fact thing. Basically, if you have trouble with your, if you have a reduced echoic memory, individuals with reduced echoic memory show late language development. So it kind of shows us how important just this sensory memory would be in something like developing your language skills. And also, it's kind of interesting, your echoic memory is active even when you're asleep. So it turns out you can hold on to information up to about 3 seconds while you're sleeping. And I'm not sure exactly how they tested that. I have to go back and take a look at that. All right, so here we go. Sensory memory. This is our first thing. This is we're just going to do this quick run through with it, but we see that it's a distinct from other memory systems we're going to talk about. Has this huge capacity, very brief duration, holds on to unprocessed information. We as cognitive psychologists are really interested what happens next. So now once we start organizing and making sense of the information, as we talked about when we were talking about perception and such, once we begin to create sort of more conscious perceptions out of the information, what happens then? And that's where we're going to get into talking about some of the other memory systems that are involved. All right, so take a look back over this, think about the different types of memory systems. Think about these sensory memory systems, the iconic and the echoic. Why do they qualify as distinct memory systems? What's going on there that allows us to say that? And also kind of tie this back to things like I've mentioned perception a couple times. Think about it in terms of potentially also in terms of attention. This notion of sensory memory, I think, connects up with a few issues there. So take a look at that as well. And we will come back and talk about we'll continue with this notion of the modal model of memory, and we'll look at short-term memory and then transition into working memory over the next few days. So looking for my buttons. All right. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Okay. See you in a bit.